So, Fools, we're really excited to welcome Myra MacPherson here with us today to talk about her latest book, The Scarlet Sisters, Sex, Suffrage, and Scandal in the Gilded Age. It also recently just came out in paperback, so that's what you guys have with you today. Myra is an award-winning, best-selling former journalist. She's written 5 books. She wrote for the Washington Star, the New York Times, and had a 24-year career with the Washington Post, where Ben Bradley hired her for the Revolutionary Style section. She's covered a diverse range of subjects from Watergate to women's liberation, including interviews with presidents, civil rights leaders, international heads of state, and a whole slew of others. So, Myra, welcome.
Thank you.
So I wanted to get started just a little bit about your background. You've covered a wide sort of swath of American history. What are some of the things that have stood out for you in your career?
Well, the good and the bad. One was that I was covering sports and in the Mad Men era, and I couldn't get in the press box in 1969, and I was covering the Miracle Mets, who had finally won the World Series, and they just said, "You can't come in. You're a woman." And he said, "The next thing you girls are going to do, you're going to want to use the locker rooms and go into the locker rooms." I said, "We don't want to use the urinals. We just want to use the typewriters." And at that stage, a famous male reporter and columnist, Red Smith, wrote a column saying, "Isn't this silly that we have these ridiculous rules?" So he helped change the idea. And then my daughter became a 3-time Emmy Award-winning producer for ESPN and was in the locker rooms all the time. And some people tried to make this a trivial little story, but it was inherently important because women were being left out of interviews with people, guys standing around in their towels, and they forced most of them to come out and get dressed, come out and have co-ed interviews because they were always getting scooped. And so, as trivial as that might have sounded, it was very important. And I know myself, I was running all over trying to find a phone that I could dictate my story in. And so that was the bad. The good was working for Ben Bradley, who was one of the few who gave women full force in 1972 when I covered the campaign, the presidential campaign. There were so few women that the book was called, about the journalist was called The Boys on the Bus. And you fought all that, but you had some fantastic times. I did a story on for the Vanity Fair on Ted Bundy, the serial killer, and got the only interview with his mother ever. And covered the Watergate. I did the Watergate profiles, interviewed all of them, and covered every presidential campaign for 5 times. And it was always fun. It was always doing what you wanted to do. I couldn't imagine any other career.
And at what point did you first hear about the sisters?
Well, in 2008, as you know, there was this great dream ticket that the Democrats were kind of saying, what about Hillary for president and Obama for vice president? And I saw this little squib that said, "It's been done before." So I looked up, and here was Victoria Woodhull, who had run for president in 1872 on a third-party ticket, and they had nominated for her vice president Frederick Douglass, the great orator and former slave. So I thought, my gosh, and so then I started reading more, and I found her sassy younger sister, Tenny, and I decided that as I went on, I realized these were the most symbiotic, avant-garde, amazing sisters in American history, and their life just took off into enormous variations on women's rights and financial rights. They fought for everything, freedom in the bedroom, in the boardroom, on the battlefield. Tenny ran for and became the first and only white woman honorary colonel of a black regiment for which they were promptly evicted. But they were an amazing duo and very, very fascinating.
And so their story really starts around 1870 when they open this brokerage firm on Wall Street.
Well, it actually started in 1868 when they found not only the richest man in America, Cornelius Vanderbilt, but a man who believed in spiritualism. And so however they got to him. And they had a background in which they said they were able to be clairvoyants and magnetic healers. And so Victoria said that she convinced him that she could talk to his very, very dead mother. And so that was an opening. And then Tenny was this magnetic healer, and the story is that they became lovers. And so for 2 years, in a quiet sotto voce way, they were all over Wall Street. They were learning everything. They made money on Black Friday, which was a terrible panic in 1869. So in 1870, they became the first women ever to become the owners of a stock firm and stock brokerage firm. And it was so phenomenal that 2,000 men on the street showed up to see them and to watch them just come in and open the thing. And they planned everything. They wore dresses that were identical. They were so scandalously short that you could see the boots as somebody rode. They cut their hair short. They said corsets were terrible for the body, which they were. They were absolutely stunning and beautiful. And even though they dressed alike, sort of giving the twin element, Tenny was 24 and Victoria was 31. And they were so good at promoting themselves and their interest in politics and finance. I said that they were a cross between Hillary Clinton and the Kardashians, only with brains. And so they just went through that and became absolutely famous and infamous overnight. They were called tramps and prostitutes simply because they walked down the streets in Wall Street. And they just kept up, and that was just the beginning.
Just the beginning. And you actually tied that back in. You recently wrote an article for Salon.com about sexism on Wall Street. What connections do you see there?
Well, it was called 145 Years of Frat Boys on Wall Street, so you might get the idea from the title. Tenny said, the only reason they were against me was I was trying to be their equal. And a woman more recently said that institutionalized sexism still remains. And doing the research, I found out that with Goldman Sachs, for example, that only 14% of the force of any importance were women. And so I found it fascinating that Tenny was, everything they said is almost as if they're talking today about women's rights. They were for everything that we're still fighting for. They were for the ability to control your own bodies, not have the clergy or government interfere. They were for equal work for equal pay, which we still don't have. They were for violence against women and rape, date rape. It was not a term, but they were then discussing it. They were for the vote, but unlike most of the suffragists, they saw the vote as meaningless, as they said, unless you can elect women, all you're going to get is the same lazy white males who are corrupt if you vote for them, and that's not worth anything. And so they were just driven in a very modern way about women's issues, and definitely sex. They said that they were free lovers, and they said that a piece of paper does not make a good marriage any more than a loveless, a non-marriage doesn't mean that it has to be it can be a romantic and loving relationship. And also, when to choose your mate, which a lot of women didn't, this was an era when men controlled everything socially and legislatively. A woman, if she tried to get a divorce, was ruined, and they couldn't get their children. So they fought against these draconian divorce laws. And very, very feisty about the fact that you should be able to have sex and enjoy it, which was also a total no-no back in those days.
So jumping back to the topic of suffrage, Victoria certainly didn't sort of stand idly by. She ran for president. She declared her candidacy in 1870. How did that go for her?
Well, I got to get sort of into everything they did. She did that, but knowing that their fame and fortune from the Vanderbilt years they had to have a real launch and a real base. So the first thing they did was get a fabulous mansion and filled it full of all of the radical thinkers and writers and politicians, and pushed and pushed and pushed her candidacy. And then they started the first two sisters to have, or women to have, a radical weekly. And in that weekly, they obviously talked about Victoria's favorite person, herself, and also an enormous number of issues. They were so clever that they would sit around in Wall Street and look at all the corruption that was going on, and then they'd write these exposés about them, which of course didn't help them with the financial world. And then they decided that they needed more of a coalition for her, and they went from capitalist to communist, and they became one of the only women's group of Karl Marx's union. And they had a rainbow coalition of blacks, Native Americans, women, and finally they were too much for even Karl Marx. He said, this is just a bunch of dilettantes. All he wanted was the white male immigrant laborers. And so he kicked them out, and Victoria said, oh, he's just nothing but a fallen despot anyway. And so they were always pushing the envelope to get things a bit more. And all this time she was getting, more, being written up more and more. And Tenney, the same in 1872, ran for Congress. And their argument was, well, there's nothing in the Constitution that says you couldn't run. Mm-hmm. Of course, the men who wrote the Constitution, those white slave-owning males, wouldn't have even dreamed of it, but they just said we can run for office. And so they pushed all of that, and then they wrote all of this into a certain period of time. And then what happened in 72 with Frederick Douglass was that at that point, when he was nominated, his house had been wrecked by arson, but we don't know for sure. They never positively said it. But he lost so much of his original writings and everything that he didn't have the heart to run. And by then, the sisters had a total dust-up with Susan B. Anthony, and a lot of things had happened that I'm not going to try to get into right now. But I think we have to recognize how these women were unbelievable liars and able to embellish everything and to just hang on to this image for quite a successfully long time. They told reporters that they came from a middle-class background, that they had a good education, that they learned law at their father's knee. Well, it was all false. Their father was a snake oil salesman of the first water who conned everybody. He one of the favorite stories of him was that he ended up painting his horses black and sold them and had to get out of town before it rained. And everything he did was like that. He made counterfeit money, and when he was being arrested, he took the money in his mouth and chewed up the evidence. So they had all that kind of background, plus a crazy, not totally sane, as they said, mother who would bay at the moon in her religious ecstasies. And they beat the kids. They were forced very young into servitude. Tenney, at the age of 11, was forced to tell fake fortune telling 13 hours a day. She tried to run away. There were stories that she at one time had run a house of assignation. There was a story that Victoria had been a prostitute. I'm not sure, but I think given that background with her father, he did what he could, because his own idea of heavy lifting was getting his beautiful daughters to work for him. So they kept that hidden until their crazy mother opened up a trial and said that her son-in-law, who was then married to Victoria, was going to kill her. Well, after their huge amount of press, I mean, they were so well known that they were like Madonna. They just had headlines that said Victoria and Tenny, or Vicky and Tenny. And after all of that, the media just jumped on this story. It went from front page all over to San Francisco and then beyond in Europe. And so they were essentially ruined to the women in the suffragist movement, all except Susan B. Anthony. Now, you may think that she was this little round lady who had 7 kids, but she was a real pistol, and she was for free love because she had an unhappy marriage, and she was very much in the sisters' corner, but most of them left them. So then that's when they had to sort of forge their own campaign for this presidency. And actually, it was a rather interesting gathering of delegates, about 600, which was what was common at both the Democratic and Republican Party. But instead of being all white male, they had American Indians, they had Chinese, they had blacks, of course, they had women, and they were all very progressive about what they thought should be done, including saying that one's body should be one's own freedom, which you can't imagine how unbelievable that was considered back then for women. Great.
And so you talked a little bit about the relationship with other parts of the women's suffrage movement at that time. You also covered the women liberation movement in the 70s. Do you see similarities between the different schisms that happened in those 2 time periods?
That's very interesting. I see the schism that's the most obvious was that the suffragists were middle-class women, and they looked at the sisters as if, once they found out their background, as if they were just slumming and didn't embrace them. Neither did the movement in the 70s. I've actually had conversation with Gloria Steinem about it, and when I said, you didn't speak to mothers, and you didn't speak to working mothers, and you didn't speak to blacks. It was a pretty elitist gathering, and she said we had to start somewhere, and we hoped to build and build. There was, of course, it's amazing now, but Betty Friedan and other groups were just appalled at the lesbians who were coming in and trying to have free rights, and they felt it would wreck the movement. And that was the same thing that Susan B. Anthony said. She said, we just have to concentrate on the vote. If we get the vote, then all this will follow. Well, of course it didn't. And the sisters were really set apart because they said, we have to get women in power. We have to get them out of the financial slog. We have to make sure that they are free from abuse, violence, and men who take advantage of them. And by all means to feel free about when and how you want to get married or have children or whatever. And all of this was just anathema to Susan B. Anthony. And there's one story when she got so mad at Victoria because she was at this great meeting, and she ran up and she said she wanted everybody to come over to her group because she was running for the presidency. And Susan B. Anthony said, you're out of order, clam. And she said, nothing, and Victoria just stood up and started yelling and saying everything. And so Susan B. Anthony ran out and found a janitor and told him to turn off all the gas lights, and everybody was in darkness. And from then on, it was irreparable hatred. But the sisters were so able to be charismatic with so many people that they did get a following, and they became famous speakers. They could hardly read and write when they started, and they used men in a male power world like men used women. They were like sponges learning from the best, and they were so captivating that many of the men, were just there willing to help them. And when they spoke, they would speak to 7,000, 8,000, 9,000 people, turning people away. They advertised, like I said, like Kardashian style. They big banners about how they were going to speak about sex, prostitution, marriage, divorce, and of course jammed the place. And Tenney was ruthless in her attacks on the double standard. She said, "Why are prostitutes arrested and the Johns go free?" She said that a woman, and they hated all the upper class women who did nothing, called them idle nothings. And they said, a woman who marries just for money is nothing more than a legalized prostitute. And this, you can imagine this speech going over in 1870 and 72 and 73. And then when they would speak across the country, there would be editorials who would say, well, they were very interesting and they said some very important things, but we're not ready for it yet.
And so their focus on the double standard came to light in a big way around 1875 with the scandal involving Reverend Beecher.
Oh, yes. It really did. By then, well, actually, it started in 72. Mm-hmm. They were, when people said, how was their campaign? I said they were in jail the day of the election. They were being trashed so much by the Beecher family. As you know, his sister wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. The other sister was an anti-suffragist and very famous. And so the two of them had ganged up and had written these romantic plays about them. So did Henry James, the noted author. And they were being trashed, and so they said notes to Beecher saying, if you don't stop your sisters, we're going to tell the world what you do, because you practice one thing, you preach one thing, which is marriage inviolate, and you practice another. And the rumors had been rampant that he'd had mistresses, and he was the most famous preacher in America, and no one thought anybody would go against them. So they were trying, and she wanted to have him introduce her at this speech, her famous I am a free lover speech. And it's a great line in the beginning of the book. It's too long to go through, about how she defined who she was. And he didn't show up as he had promised. So the next thing they did was they ran this article, and which she said, among other things, and also as she gave speeches, that he preaches to 16 of his mistresses at least every Sunday. And they immediately, his church and everybody yelled foul and tried to sue them. And then Tenney wrote about the rape of a virgin at a masked ball by a major financier. And that, of course, brought on more. So they were in and out of lawsuits constantly. But there was this man named Anthony Comstock who felt he was the major person to handle vice in every way, shape, or form. And he saw sin in medical drawings. You read his diary, and it's just amazing. Every morning he was sinning something. We think it might have been masturbation, but we don't know. He just never announced it, but this was just when he was a child. And then as he got older, he pushed to be this head of vice with the YMCA. And he managed to become so famous that there were cartoons. And one of them was him standing next to a woman and talking to the judge, and he said, "Your Honor, this woman just gave birth to a naked baby." and he was so bad, and he threw them into jail, in and out of jail. They were in rat-infested holes. This was a misdemeanor at the most. They finally got acquitted, but by then I think Victoria had at least one nervous breakdown, being thrown in and out. The federal government came and wrecked everything, their printing press, their house, everything that they owned in their offices. They came out and they had absolutely nothing. And the women's movement, actually, even their friend Elizabeth Cady Stanton, wouldn't help them when they were in prison. So they felt, really, really put upon. And they said, to heck with this. And in 1877, they took off for England and married two of the richest men in England and lived happily ever after for about 50 more years. But they had to denounce free love in order to get into this. And actually, in later life, everybody kind of understood it because they'd had such a terrible treatment in the United States. And but they kept on the women's movement issues. But I have to tell you about the chutzpah.
Please.
The chutzpah of Victoria. She and her husband were the first people ever to sue the British Museum for libelous material that was on the shelves, and some of it was written by her, and they got a partial victory. They were able to just pull everything off. And of course, Tenny was kind of the hoyden. She was the one who was funny and outspoken, and she had a boyfriend who was the editor of the New York Sun, and some of the great writing about them may have been because of her relationship. But her line about the press is, she said, "Oh, we love the press. They're the salt of the earth, and they keep everything from spoiling." And she also, they were at Delmonico's, which was a very famous restaurant, and they were in there after work at night. And the owner came over and quietly said, you can't be in here at night without an escort. And Tenny had just ordered soup for two. And she said, I'll fix that. She went out to the carriage and got the carriage driver off with his hat and his red livery and his boots, and brought him in and plunked him down and said, soup for three. So they had this ability to be much like the guys who were on Wall Street, because they were the robber barons. Many of them were illiterate, came from nowhere, had a reckless drive, could win all one day, lose the other. And in many ways, they were more akin to them than they were to the suffrage movement. But the suffrage movement lost a great voice when they shut them out. In fact, the reason a lot of people don't know them is because they were written out of the women's movement. Mm-hmm. Major historical stuff written in 1882 by Susan B. Anthony and her friends.
So we'll open up to questions in just a second. Yeah. One more question for you. A lot of the reviews about the book mention how timely the book is. Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about why this was an important story to tell now?
It's because, unfortunately, so many of the issues that they pushed are still in problematic areas. Pro-choice, there are something like 300 laws all across the country watering it down or maybe close it entirely. I think young women have absolutely no idea what's that like. I covered it before it was legal, and it was a tragedy for so many women. Contraception is being withheld for women who have no money. The attitudes on everything from divorce, etc., have changed now, but it took a long time. I mean, look at the fight for gay rights and the fight for lesbians and transgender. This is all still a struggle, and the kind of people who are fighting it now, the sort of moral majority, if you will, were the same kind of people who fought what the sisters said back then. It was the clergy and the middle America kind of people. So that's apparently why everybody says it. So, I mean, one review said, read the epilogue first because you know exactly what had happened. And we've talked about this, but when women have no real position of majority in any way, shape, or form, a lot does not get accomplished. That doesn't mean all women are the same, of course. You know, you have Sarah Palin and you have some others on the other side. And in fact, it's going to be interesting to see how things shake down. But in many ways, of the 20 women in the Senate, I've spent a lot of time with some of them, and they really work together, and they work strongly together, and they're so smart and caring about these issues.
Great.